The unforgiving flash of 100 cameras can feel like a physical blow. For Isabella Beaumont, it was the sound of her world shattering. On the iconic steps of the Met, her husband of 10 years, the formidable CEO Richard Beaumont, didn't just leave her, he replaced her. In front of the entire world, he cast her aside for a younger woman, leaving Isabella, a solitary, abandoned figure in a sea of couture and judgment. They called her a tragic footnote in a billionaire's love story. They thought she would disappear. But they forgot one thing: embers can survive any storm, and sometimes they return as a wildfire. The air on the first Monday in May always crackled with a unique kind of energy, a potent cocktail of old money, new fame, and the silent, vicious judgment of the global elite. For Isabella Beaumont, the annual Met Gala had always been the pinnacle of this world, a night she meticulously planned for months. As the wife of Richard Beaumont, the ruthless CEO of the monolithic Beaumont Holdings, her role was clear: be the perfect, elegant accessory. She curated his image, smoothed over his social brutalities, and ensured their table was the most sought after in the grand hall. She was the architect of his social reign, a ghost writer for his public life. This year felt different. The ride to the museum in their custom Rolls-Royce Phantom was suffocatingly silent. Richard hadn't looked at her once, his jaw a hard line of granite, as he stared out at the flashing lights of Manhattan. Isabella, dressed in a bespoke midnight blue gown by Chanel that had taken 400 hours to bead, felt a familiar chill creep up her spine. It was a coldness that had been growing in their Park Avenue penthouse for months, a silence that devoured conversation and left a void in its wake. "You look tense, darling," she said, her voice a soft melody she hoped might soothe the beast beside her. He finally turned his head, his steel-grey eyes sweeping over her with an unnerving detachment, as if she were a piece of art he was considering selling. "Just thinking about business, Isabella. You wouldn't understand." The condescension, once a subtle prick, was now a dagger's edge. She had a master's degree in art history from the Sorbonne, spoke 4 languages, and had single-handedly negotiated the acquisition of a Parisian boutique hotel that was now one of their most profitable assets. But in Richard's world, her contributions were invisible, unacknowledged. As they stepped onto the cream-colored carpet, the roar of the press was deafening. "Richard, Isabella. Over here." The flashes were a relentless, blinding assault. Richard's hand was on her lower back, a proprietary gesture that felt less like affection and more like ownership. He smiled, his predator's smile for the cameras, a perfect performance of a man in control. Isabella mirrored him, her own smile, a fragile mask she had perfected over a decade. They were halfway up the grand staircase when he stopped. The pause was so abrupt that the flow of celebrity traffic behind them stuttered. He pulled his hand away from her back. The absence of his touch was a physical shock, as cold and final as a closing door. "Richard, what is it?" she whispered, her smile faltering. He didn't look at her. He looked past her down the stairs. And that's when Isabella saw her. Chloe Sterling, a model barely out of her teens with eyes as vacant as her ambitions were transparent. She was wearing a scandalously sheer dress, a stark contrast to Isabella's timeless elegance. Chloe was ascending the stairs, a smug smile playing on her lips. Richard's voice was low, devoid of any emotion. Yet it was the cruelest sound Isabella had ever heard. "Our journey together ends here, Isabella." The world seemed to slow down. The roar of the press faded into a dull hum. She could see the reporters from Vogue, and the New York Times, their eyes widening, sensing the seismic shift. "What are you talking about?" She managed, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I'm saying this is over," he said, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were flat, merciless. "I've filed for divorce. My lawyers will be in touch with yours. Chloe is my date for the evening." He turned his back on her. He walked down 2 steps and took Chloe's waiting hand, pulling her up to his side. He kissed Chloe, a possessive, performative act for the world to see right there on the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And then together they continued up the stairs, leaving Isabella standing completely, utterly alone. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, she was frozen, a statue of discarded grace. Then the cameras, realizing what had just happened, turned on her. The flashes became frantic, hungry. The questions were shouted sharp and brutal. "Isabella, is it true? Did he just leave you on the red carpet?" "Mrs. Beaumont, what are your thoughts on Chloe Sterling?" Every flash felt like a stone being thrown. Every shouted question was a new crack in her crumbling facade. She could feel the pitying stares from Anna Wintour, the schadenfreude-laced glances from rival society wives. She was no longer Isabella Beaumont, wife of a titan. She was a spectacle, a tragedy in real time. Her breath hitched. The magnificent gown felt like a lead weight. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she turned, ignoring the cacophony. She did not run. She walked, head held high, back down the stairs through the gauntlet of gawking celebrities and ravenous press, each step an agony of public humiliation. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Because if she did, the entire world would see that the perfect, polished wife of Richard Beaumont was weeping. As she stumbled out onto the street, the cold night air hitting her tear-streaked face, she heard the final pronouncement from a television reporter speaking into his camera. "In the most shocking red carpet moment of the decade, billionaire Richard Beaumont has publicly ended his marriage to Isabella Beaumont, debuting his new relationship with model Chloe Sterling. A truly brutal end to a society fairy tale." Isabella hailed the first yellow cab. She saw a lifeboat in a stormy sea. As she crumpled into the worn leather seat, the driver looked at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes wide. "Lady, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse." She whispered the words, catching in her throat, as the cab sped away from the glittering museum, carrying her away from the ruins of her life. "I've just become one." The divorce was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Richard, with his army of ruthless lawyers from Skadden Arps, didn't just want to end the marriage. He wanted to erase Isabella from the narrative of his success. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed at 24, naive and blinded by love, was ironclad. It entitled her to a settlement that, while substantial to an ordinary person, was a pittance to a man of Richard's stature, a calculated insult designed to remind her of her place. The media, fueled by strategic leaks from Richard's PR team, painted a damning portrait of her. She was portrayed as a socialite wife, with extravagant spending habits, mentally unstable and emotionally volatile. They twisted her passion for art into a frivolous hobby, her meticulous event planning into obsessive control. Chloe Sterling was photographed laughing with Richard on a yacht in St. Bart's, while tabloids ran grainy pictures of Isabella, cloaked in a large coat and sunglasses, looking like a fugitive in her own city. The Park Avenue penthouse, once her sanctuary, became a gilded cage filled with ghosts. Every Lalique vase, every Rothko on the wall, was a testament to a life that was no longer hers. Movers dispatched by Richard's office came and packed her things with cold, impersonal efficiency. They were careful not to damage the assets that belonged to the Beaumont estate. Her personal belongings felt small and insignificant in comparison. Her friends, the society women with whom she'd shared lunches at Balthazar and charity board meetings, vanished. Their calls went unanswered. Their polite, pitying smiles were replaced with a stony silence. She was a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails at the polo bar. To associate with her was to risk the ire of Richard Beaumont, and no one was willing to pay that price. 1 month after the Met Gala broken and utterly adrift, Isabella left New York City. She drove for 7 hours in her modest Audi, the only car registered solely in her name, until she reached the coast of Maine. There, nestled in a rocky cove overlooking the tumultuous Atlantic, was a small, salt-weathered cottage her grandmother had left her. It was the only thing Richard hadn't been able to touch. The cottage was her antithesis to Park Avenue. It smelled of old books, sea salt and wood smoke. The floors creaked, the windows rattled in the wind, and the plumbing was temperamental. It was perfect. For weeks, she did nothing. She slept. She walked the foggy shoreline, and she stared at the relentless grey waves, feeling a kinship with their turbulent, ceaseless motion. She let the grief wash over her, a tide of betrayal, humiliation, and profound loss. She cried until she had no tears left, her sobs swallowed by the roar of the ocean. One rainy afternoon, seeking refuge from the storm, both outside and within, she climbed the rickety ladder to the cottage's small attic. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light from a grimy porthole window. The attic was a graveyard of forgotten things: old furniture draped in white sheets, a child's rocking horse, and stacks of cardboard boxes. In one corner, she found a large wooden trunk, her grandmother's trunk. Prying open the rusted latch, she was greeted by the familiar, comforting scent of aged paper. Inside were not old clothes or keepsakes, but her own forgotten life. There were her college textbooks on Florentine art, her dissertation on the female painters of the Baroque period, and notebooks filled with her meticulous, elegant script, detailing her research and her passionate original theories. She had been brilliant, a rising star in her academic field, the youngest person to ever be offered a fellowship at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. She had given it all up for Richard. He had called her passion a cute hobby, but had insisted that the wife of a man like him couldn't have a job. Her place was by his side, and she, so in love, had agreed. She had packed her ambitions away in this very trunk, believing that his life was now hers. Flipping through the pages of a notebook, her fingers traced a sketch she had made of Artemisia Gentileschi's Judith slaying Holofernes. She remembered the fire she had felt studying that painting, a raw depiction of female rage and righteous vengeance. A small, unfamiliar feeling began to flicker in the cold, empty space in her chest. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was something harder, something sharper. It was indignation. She had allowed him to diminish her. She had let him convince her that her only value was as a reflection of his own greatness. He hadn't just taken her home and her name. He had tried to take her very identity. That night, for the first time in months, she didn't just sleep. She dreamt. She dreamt of gilded frames and the smell of oil paint, of dusty archives, and the thrill of discovery. She dreamt of the woman she was before she became Mrs. Beaumont. The next morning, the storm had broken. A sliver of pale sun cut through the clouds, illuminating the sea. Isabella made a pot of coffee, sat down at the old wooden desk, overlooking the ocean, and opened a fresh notebook. She uncapped a pen, its click echoing in the quiet cottage. At the top of the page, she wrote not Isabella Beaumont, but her maiden name, the name of the woman who had once been promised a fellowship at the Uffizi, Isabella Rossi. And beneath it, she wrote her first title in over a decade, The Unseen Hand, Patronage and Power in the Medici Courts. The storm inside her was far from over, but for the first time she wasn't drowning. She was learning to build a lighthouse. The quiet solitude of the Maine coast became Isabella's crucible. The days melted into a routine governed not by social calendars, but by her own burgeoning intellectual curiosity. She rose with the sun, walked the beach as the morning mist rolled off the Atlantic, and then spent 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day hunched over her research. The world of Renaissance art, which she had abandoned for a decade, welcomed her back like a long-lost friend. She converted the small sunroom of the cottage into a study, lining the walls with second-hand bookshelves that soon overflowed. She used a portion of her settlement to acquire rare auction catalogues, scholarly journals, and obscure historical texts. Her mind, once dulled by years of small talk and society gossip, sharpened to a razor's edge. She was reconnecting with the part of herself she had been forced to amputate to fit into Richard's world. After 3 months of intense private work, she felt a stirring of something she hadn't felt in years: ambition. She wanted to share her discoveries, to re-enter the conversation she had been absent from for so long. But the academic world was insular, and the name Isabella Beaumont was now toxic, synonymous with tabloid scandal. She needed a new platform, a way to build a reputation based purely on the merit of her work. She decided to start a blog. It felt modern, accessible, and crucially, it allowed her a degree of anonymity. She called it the Gilded Brush. Her first post was an incisive, brilliantly argued piece on the misattribution of a minor work long thought to be from the studio of Titian. Using stylistic analysis and cross-referencing pigment sourcing from 16th century Venetian shipping manifests a research angle. No one had explored, she argued compellingly, that it was actually the work of a forgotten female artist, Irene di Spilimbergo. She published the post under the simple, academic-sounding byline, I, Rossi. For a week there was silence. Then a single comment appeared. It was from a professor emeritus at Oxford. A fascinating and audacious claim, Ms. Rossi. You may be onto something. That one comment was like a crack of lightning. Slowly, others followed. Art historians, curators, and serious collectors began to take notice. Her writing was a revelation, passionate but rigorously academic, accessible but deeply intelligent. She wrote about the economics of art in the Dutch Golden Age, the political propaganda hidden in Jacobean portraiture, and the secret rivalries of the great masters. The Gilded Brush became a cult favorite in the art world. Its mysterious author, I. Rossi, a subject of intense speculation. 6 months after its inception, the blog had tens of thousands of dedicated readers. Museums started citing her work in their digital archives. Prestigious art journals requested submissions. All of this happened in a world far removed from the gossip columns of Page 6, which were still breathlessly documenting Richard and Chloe's vapid escapades. One evening, an email arrived that made Isabella's heart stop. The sender was Adrian Thorne, the founder and CEO of Thorne Ventures, a boutique investment firm known for its aggressive, forward-thinking strategies. Thorne Ventures was the sharpest, most agile rival to the staid behemoth Beaumont Holdings. But Isabella knew Adrian Thorne for another reason. He was one of the most astute and private art collectors in the world. The email was brief and direct. Subject: Your work on D. Spilimbergo, Ms. Rossi. I have been following your blog, The Gilded Brush, with great interest. Your scholarship is impeccable, and your perspective is refreshingly original. Your piece on Irene di Spilimbergo was nothing short of revolutionary. I believe I may own the very piece you wrote about. I would be honored if you would consider a private consultation to verify your findings. My firm will of course compensate you for your time and travel. Sincerely, Adrian Thorne. Isabella stared at the screen, her mind racing. This was it. This was the bridge from her isolated cottage back into the world, not as a disgraced wife, but as a respected expert. It was a chance to prove her worth on her own terms. But it also meant stepping out from behind the anonymity of I, Rossi. It meant facing the world, a world that might still see her as Richard Beaumont's pathetic ex-wife. And there was another complication. Adrian Thorne was Richard's most significant business rival. Their enmity was the stuff of Wall Street legend. For her to work with him would be seen as a profound act of betrayal by some and a declaration of war by others. A year ago, the thought would have terrified her. She would have worried about how it looked about Richard's reaction. But as she looked around her sunroom, at the books that were now her friends, and the words that were now her armor, she felt a surge of defiant strength. Richard had never cared about how his actions looked to her. He had never considered her feelings. Why should she still be living her life in the shadow of his ego? She took a deep breath, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, with a steady hand, she began to type her reply. Mr. Thorne. Thank you for your kind words. I would be delighted to arrange a consultation. Sincerely, Isabella Rossi. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The sea breeze blew in through the open window, carrying the scent of salt and new beginnings. The game had just changed. 2 weeks later, Isabella stood before the gleaming steel and glass headquarters of Thorne Ventures in downtown Manhattan. The building was a statement, sleek, modern, and audacious, a stark contrast to the heavy neoclassical monolith that housed Beaumont Holdings. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, she walked through the revolving doors. The interior was more like an art gallery than a corporate office. A massive Anselm Kiefer painting dominated the lobby, and the receptionist sat behind a desk that looked like a Zaha Hadid sculpture. Everything about the place spoke of a modern, refined taste that was worlds away from Richard's ostentatious displays of wealth. She was led directly to the top floor. Adrian Thorne's office was a corner suite with panoramic views of the city, but Isabella's eyes were immediately drawn to the painting hanging on the wall behind his desk. It was the Titian, or rather the Di Spilimbergo. It was more vibrant and emotionally resonant in person than any photograph could convey. Adrian Thorne rose from his desk to greet her. He was younger than Richard, perhaps in his early 40s, with dark, intelligent eyes that held a hint of amusement. He was dressed in a tailored suit, but wore no tie, projecting an air of relaxed confidence. Miss Rossi, he said, his voice a warm baritone. He extended a hand. Adrian Thorne, it's a genuine honor to meet the mind behind the gilded brush. The honor is mine, Mr. Thorne. Thank you for inviting me. Isabella replied, her voice steady, despite the flutter in her stomach. There was no flicker of recognition in his eyes, no sign that he saw her as the disgraced wife from the tabloids. He saw her as I, Rossi the scholar. It was an incredibly liberating feeling. Please call me Adrian, he said, gesturing to a pair of leather chairs near the painting. So this is the lady in question. Tell me everything? For the next 2 hours, Isabella lost herself in her passion. She spoke about the subtle brushwork, the unique composition of the lapis lazuli pigment in the subject's robes, and the painting's provenance, which she had painstakingly traced through centuries of private sales. Adrian listened intently, asking sharp, insightful questions. He wasn't just a man who bought art. He was a man who understood it. "It's conclusive," she finished, her voice filled with conviction. "The brushwork is identical to the 2 other confirmed works by D. Spilimbergo. This isn't just from Titian's studio. This is her masterpiece." Adrian stared at the painting for a long moment, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Incredible. I've had a dozen so-called experts look at this piece, and they all told me what I wanted to hear. It's a Titian. You're the first person to tell me the truth." He turned his gaze back to her, and his eyes were full of genuine admiration. "You have an extraordinary gift, Isabella." He had used her first name, and for the first time she felt he might know who she was. She braced herself for the inevitable question about Richard, but it never came. Instead, he said, "This brings me to my real reason for inviting you here. I am in the process of establishing a philanthropic foundation dedicated to acquiring and promoting the work of historically overlooked female artists. I need a director to shape its vision, to lead the research, and to curate the collection. Someone with integrity, a brilliant eye, and the courage to challenge the established consensus. I want you." Isabella was speechless. A foundation, her own collection to build. It was a dream she had never even dared to entertain. "Mr. Thorne, Adrian, I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Say you'll consider it," he said gently. "The position would give you complete autonomy and a substantial budget. We would provide you with a research team, a lab, and a gallery space right here in this building." It was an offer that would not only restore her career, but elevate it to heights she had never imagined. It would also place her in direct opposition to her former life. Richard was a major patron of the Met, his name emblazoned on a wing. For his ex-wife to helm a new rival foundation, backed by his biggest competitor, would be a public declaration of war. As if reading her mind, Adrian's tone became more serious. "I'm aware of your history, Isabella. I won't pretend I'm not. To be frank, it's one of the reasons I sought you out. Richard Beaumont has underestimated talented people his entire life, especially women. I have a feeling he made the biggest mistake of his career when he underestimated you. His loss could be my foundation's greatest gain." There was no pity in his voice, only respect and opportunity. He wasn't offering her a handout. He was offering her a throne of her own. Meanwhile, at Beaumont Holdings, the cracks were beginning to show. Richard had always relied on Isabella's intuitive understanding of people and culture to seal his international deals. She was the one who knew which government official's wife was a fan of a particular jewelry designer, or which obscure cultural custom to observe to show respect. With Chloe by his side, who was more interested in photo opportunities than diplomatic subtleties, a massive deal for a luxury resort development in Japan had just collapsed. The Japanese partners cited a lack of cultural synergy and a disrespectful presentation, a presentation Chloe had insisted on modernizing. The loss was a staggering 9-figure blow to the company's prestige and bottom line, sending tremors through the boardroom. Richard was furious, but he was blind to the true cause of the problem, the absence of the silent partner who had always been his greatest asset. Isabella looked from Adrian's earnest face to the masterpiece on the wall, a work of genius by a woman history had tried to forget. She thought of the cottage in Maine of the anonymous blog, and of the woman she was becoming. She was done being silent. She was done being invisible. "Adrian," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I accept." A grin spread across his face, lighting up his entire demeanor. "Excellent. Welcome to the Thorn Foundation Director, Rossi. I think we're going to make history." The announcement of the Thorn Foundation with Isabella Rossi as its inaugural director sent a shockwave through the worlds of art, business, and society. The story was irresistible. The scorned wife of Richard Beaumont, long dismissed as a mere socialite, had re-emerged as a powerful new player backed by her ex-husband's chief rival. Vanity Fair ran a feature profile titled The Rossi Renaissance, complete with stunning portraits of Isabella in her new office, looking poised, intelligent, and in control. She was no longer a victim. She was a victor. For Richard, the news was a public and personal humiliation. He had tried to bury her, to render her irrelevant. Instead, she had risen from the ashes, more formidable than ever. His rage was volcanic. He saw it as a calculated attack, a conspiracy between the two people he despised most. His paranoia, coupled with the mounting financial pressure on Beaumont Holdings after a series of missteps, was making him erratic and short-tempered. The epicenter of this looming collision was the annual Orion Ball, the most exclusive charity gala of the year. For the past decade, it had been hosted and chaired by the Beaumonts. It was Isabella's signature event. Her meticulous planning and impeccable taste were what made it the jewel of the New York social season. This year, the reins had been handed to Chloe Sterling. The result was a catastrophe in the making. Chloe's vision was loud, garish, and self-serving. The theme was a chaotic diamonds and decadence, and the press was filled with reports of disgruntled vendors, clashing color schemes, and Chloe's diva-like demands. The old guard of New York society was quietly pulling their support, and ticket sales were lagging for the first time in the event's history. The Orion Ball was becoming a reflection of Richard's own declining empire, flashy on the surface but hollow within. In her new office overlooking Central Park, Isabella received her invitation. It was addressed to Ms. Isabella Rossi and guest. A week later, Adrian casually mentioned it. "I assume you won't be going," he said, leaning against her office doorframe. "It was my event for 10 years, Isabella said, her voice neutral as she examined a research document. "I built it from a simple fundraiser into what it is, or what it was." "It would be a statement." Adrian noted his eyes, watching her carefully. "Your first public appearance at a major event since—" He didn't need to finish. Since the Met Gala. The scene of her execution. The idea of returning to that world, of facing those same people, sent a flicker of her old fear through her. But it was quickly replaced by something else: resolve. She wasn't that broken woman in the Chanel gown anymore. "I won't be hiding Adrian," she said, looking up and meeting his gaze. "But I won't go alone." His smile was subtle. "I would be honored to be your guest director, Rossi." Isabella knew she couldn't just attend. She had to arrive. This wasn't just an evening out. It was a strategic maneuver. She contacted a young avant-garde designer named Marcus Thorne, no relation to Adrian, a fact that amused them both, who was known for his architectural, sculptural gowns. She didn't want a dress. She wanted armor. For weeks, they worked in secret. She showed him photos of Carthaginian warriors and Byzantine mosaics. She spoke of strength, resilience, and the beauty of molten gold. The result was a masterpiece. The gown was crafted from a liquid gold lamb that shimmered and moved like it was alive. It was deceptively simple in its silhouette, a high neck, long sleeves, and a column skirt that pooled at the floor. But its power was in its texture and its unapologetic, brilliant radiance. It was the color of a crown, of a treasure unearthed. The night of the Orion Ball arrived. The ballroom at the plaza was a chaotic mess of Chloe's design ice sculptures, dripped onto priceless rugs, and the floral arrangements were aggressively large. Richard, looking strained and older than his years, was on stage attempting to give the opening remarks. His speech was stilted, his usual charisma gone, replaced by a desperate, blustering energy as he tried to rally support for a new Beaumont Holdings project. And it is with this vision of the future, he was saying, his voice echoing slightly in the half-empty room, that Beaumont Holdings will continue to lead. At that exact moment, the grand doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Heads turned, conversations halted. Richard faltered mid-sentence, his eyes following the gaze of his audience. Framed in the doorway stood Isabella. She was a vision of pure molten gold. The gown caught the light from the chandeliers, bathing her in a halo of brilliance. Her hair was swept back in a severe, elegant chignon, showcasing a pair of simple diamond earrings, the only jewelry she wore. Her face was serene, her posture perfect. She wasn't just wearing a dress. She was inhabiting it. Beside her, Adrian Thorne was a figure of quiet strength, his hand resting lightly on her back. The press, who had been huddled by the bar complaining about the event, suddenly surged forward. The sound was like a sudden crack of thunder, the frantic, hungry clicking and flashing of dozens of cameras all aimed at one person. The flashes bounced off her golden gown, creating a dazzling, almost blinding spectacle. On stage, Richard Beaumont was frozen. His mouth hung slightly open. The teleprompter continued to scroll, but he had lost his place, lost his voice. All he could see was the woman he had thrown away, standing in the doorway of his failing party, looking not like a ghost from his past, but like the queen of a new and better kingdom. She met his shocked gaze from across the room, and for the first time in more than a year, she gave him a small, knowing, and utterly triumphant smile. The king had been checkmated in his own castle. The effect of Isabella's arrival was cataclysmic. She and Adrian didn't just enter the room, they conquered it. Within minutes, they were surrounded by the very people who had shunned her a year ago. Bankers, artists, and society matriarchs who had once ghosted her calls were now falling over themselves to praise the Thorne Foundation, to compliment her gown, to simply be seen in her orbit. Power, she realized, was a more compelling currency than history. She was no longer Richard's ex-wife. She was the woman who had Adrian Thorne's ear. From his position on the stage, Richard watched the scene unfold with a fury that was nearly apoplectic. He aborted his speech, mumbling a few concluding remarks to a distracted audience, and stormed off the stage, his face a thunderous mask. Chloe, looking flustered and cheap in her garish diamond-encrusted dress, hurried after him. "Richard, what do we do?" she hissed, grabbing his arm. "She's ruining everything. Stay away from her," Richard snarled, shaking her off. "I'll handle this." He cut a swath through the crowd, his presence parting the sea of guests until he stood before Isabella. Adrian, sensing the confrontation, subtly positioned himself at her side, a silent guardian. "Isabella," Richard began, his voice a low growl. "What a surprise. I didn't think you'd have the nerve to show your face here." Isabella met his rage with a calm that was more unnerving than any shouted reply. "Hello, Richard. You seem tense. Are things not going as planned?" She gestured vaguely at the garish decorations. "This is all very Chloe." The insult, delivered with such cool precision, struck a nerve. "You think this is funny?" he shot back. "Coming here on the arm of this vulture trying to sabotage my event? Your event seems to be sabotaging itself just fine. Adrian interjected smoothly, his voice dangerously mild. And I'd watch who you're calling a vulture, Richard, especially when your own company is starting to look a lot like carrion. Richard's face flushed a deep red. You stay out of this, Thorn. This is between me and my wife. Ex-wife, Isabella corrected him, her voice like a chip of ice. And you have no right to speak to me or about me any longer. You forfeited that right on the steps of the Met. For a moment, Richard looked genuinely stunned, as if he couldn't comprehend her defiance. He was so accustomed to her placating him, to her absorbing his anger. He tried a different tactic, his voice dropping into a mock, sympathetic tone. Look at you, Isabella, dressed up in a ridiculous costume, playing businesswoman. Do you really think this little act will last? You're nothing without the Beaumont name. It was his final, most desperate weapon, the attempt to diminish her, to remind her of the scared, broken woman she once was. But that woman was gone. You're wrong, she said, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity and strength that silenced the onlookers who had gathered to watch the drama. I was never nothing. My mistake was thinking I needed your name to be something. The truth, Richard, is that you were the one who needed me. And then Adrian delivered the killing blow. She's right, you know, he said, a look of clinical pity on his face. Take the Ato Corp deal in Japan. You lost nearly $1 billion in projected revenue because you and your associate... He glanced dismissively at Chloe, who was hovering nearby. Managed to offend Mr. Tanaka by presenting him with a gift using your left hand. A catastrophic insult. Richard stared at him, bewildered. How could you possibly know that? Because Isabella told me, Adrian said. She told me that Mr. Tanaka was a stickler for traditional etiquette. She told me his wife was an admirer of the 18th century ceramicist Otagaki Rengetsu. So when I met with him last week, I presented Mrs. Tanaka with a rare Rengetsu tea bowl, using my right hand, of course. Thorn Ventures signed an exclusive partnership with Ito Corp yesterday morning. It would seem Isabella's cute hobby of understanding culture just made my company $1 billion. The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. He staggered back, his face ashen. All this time he had been failing without understanding why. It was her. It had always been her. Her quiet intelligence, her social grace, her invisible hand guiding his success. As his world tilted on its axis, the final twist of the knife came from an unexpected source. A flustered-looking man in a tuxedo, one of Richard's board members, rushed over, grabbing his arm. "Richard, thank God I found you," the man said, his voice a panicked whisper. "We have a massive problem. There's been a data breach. Someone on the inside has been leaking our Q4 earnings projections and sensitive negotiation strategies to Morgan Stanley for weeks. The SEC just launched a formal investigation." Richard looked utterly lost. But Isabella's mind, now honed by months of analytical work, made the connection instantly. She looked past Richard to where Chloe was standing. The younger woman's face was pale with terror. She was discreetly trying to slip her phone into her purse, but not before Isabella saw the Morgan Stanley logo on an open email app. Chloe, the ultimate opportunist, had been selling him out, hedging her bets for when his empire finally crumbled. Isabella looked at Richard, a defeated, bewildered man betrayed by the woman for whom he had destroyed his own marriage and outmaneuvered by the wife he had so arrogantly discarded. There was no triumph in her heart, no joy in his destruction. There was only a quiet, sad finality. "It appears you have bigger problems than my choice of evening wear, Richard," she said softly. Turning her back on the ruins of her former husband, she took Adrian's arm. "I believe I've had enough of this party. Shall we go?" As they walked away, leaving Richard to face the implosion of his company. And his life, Isabella did not look back. The implosion of Richard Beaumont's world was not a single clean explosion, but a slow, grinding collapse. The story of Chloe Sterling's corporate espionage, a betrayal so brazen it became a case study in business schools, was the initial detonation. But the shrapnel that followed was relentless. The SEC investigation froze his assets. The board of Beaumont Holdings, a collection of men he'd always considered his loyal lieutenants, turned on him with the swift, impersonal viciousness of a predator sensing a fatal wound. The emergency board meeting was held in the familiar 80th floor conference room, a space where Richard had brokered billion-dollar deals and crushed countless competitors. But that day, he was the one being crushed. He watched the faces around the polished mahogany table faces that had once laughed at his jokes and sought his approval and saw only cool, hard calculation. His blustering defense was met with stony silence. His threats were met with pitying glances. When the final vote of no confidence was cast a unanimous decision, it felt less like a betrayal and more like an inevitability. The final page of a book he hadn't realized he was writing. He was escorted from the building by security, his access badge deactivated before he even reached the lobby. The empire his grandfather had built, the one he had ruled with an iron fist, had locked its doors to him. His descent was a spectacle. He retreated to the cavernous Park Avenue penthouse, but the silence within its walls was more deafening than the roar of the city outside. His calls to former allies went to voicemail. His invitations were regretfully declined. He was a king without a kingdom, a ghost rattling around a museum of his former life. The tabloids which had once documented his every triumph now chronicled his every stumble. They printed long-lens photos of him on his balcony, unshaven and hollow-eyed, a modern-day Lear raging against a storm of his own making. The world he had commanded had not only forgotten him, it was actively erasing him. In stark contrast, Isabella's world was expanding in every direction. The Thorn Foundation was no longer a nascent project, but a cultural powerhouse. Under her directorship, they had successfully authenticated and acquired a breathtaking portrait by Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, a piece long thought lost. At the press conference announcing the acquisition, Isabella spoke with an eloquence and passion that captivated the art world. She wasn't just a director, she was a storyteller, breathing life back into the forgotten legacies of brilliant women. Forbes featured her on their 40 over 40 list, not as a socialite or a comeback story, but as a visionary shaping the future of art. Her relationship with Adrian Thorne had deepened into a partnership that was as intellectually stimulating as it was emotionally fulfilling. They were equals in every sense. They would spend long evenings in the Foundation's private library, debating the nuances of a new acquisition or planning their next ambitious project. It was a love built not on power dynamics or public performance, but on quiet conversations, shared laughter, and a profound mutual respect. He admired her mind and her resilience. She loved his integrity and the way his eyes lit up when she explained the history of a particular brushstroke. It was a love that was calm, steady, and real. When the news of the court-ordered bankruptcy auction of Richard's personal effects was made public, Isabella felt a complex pang of emotions. There was no triumphant glee, no sense of vindication. There was only a quiet, somber ache for the man he might have been, and for the years she had lost trying to find him. Adrian saw the news on his tablet and looked over at her, his expression unreadable. "A final chapter," he said softly. "I suppose so." she replied, her gaze distant. She had no intention of going. It felt ghoulish, like attending an estate sale for a life she had once shared. But that evening, while browsing the online catalogue out of a morbid curiosity, she saw it. Lot 47B, A View of the Grand Canal, by Canaletto. The painting wasn't the most valuable piece in the collection, nor the most famous, but it was the one piece that held a sliver of the real Richard the boy he'd been before ambition had calcified his heart. It had hung in the library of his family's Connecticut estate, and he had once confessed to her, during a rare, unguarded moment early in their marriage, that as a lonely child, he would sit and stare into its sun-drenched Venetian world for hours, finding a peace there that his own life lacked. It was the only object he'd ever loved without considering its monetary value. A sudden clear resolve formed in her mind. This wasn't about Richard. This was about legacy and the quiet dignity that even a fallen man deserved. The auction at Sotheby's was a somber affair, a room full of vultures picking over the carcass of a lion. Isabella slipped into a seat in the back row, wearing a simple black dress and dark glasses, drawing no attention to herself. She watched as Richard's life was sold off piece by piece. His custom. Patek Philippe. Watch his fleet of supercars, the garish jewelry he had bought for Chloe. All of it went under the hammer, each sale punctuated by the sharp, final crack of the auctioneer's gavel. Finally, Lot 47B was brought onto the stage. The Canaletto seemed to radiate a gentle, golden light, a pocket of serene beauty amidst the cold transactionalism of the room. The bidding started low. Then a man in the front row, a notoriously ruthless hedge fund manager named Marcus Blackwood, who was known for buying the assets of his vanquished rivals as trophies, began to bid. He did it with a smug, theatrical flair, clearly enjoying the symbolism of acquiring the last remnant of the Beaumont family's heritage. The other bidders quickly dropped out, unwilling to challenge him. The auctioneer began his final call. Going once, going twice. Isabella felt a stillness settle over her. This wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption. Not his, but hers. It was about choosing grace in a world that had shown her none. Just as the hammer was about to fall, she raised her paddle. A collective murmur rippled through the auction house. Heads turned. Marcus Blackwood shot an irritated glance over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place the woman in the back row. He sneered and signaled a higher bid. Isabella, her expression placid, calmly countered. The duel began. The price climbed, soaring past the painting's estimate. The room was silent, all eyes on the two bidders. It was a battle of wills, a clash of two different worlds. His bidding was aggressive, fueled by ego and the desire to dominate. Her bidding was quiet, calm, and implacable. Blackwood was buying a trophy. She was saving a memory. Finally, with the price at a staggering figure, Blackwood, red-faced and frustrated by her refusal to be intimidated, threw his hands up in defeat. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, his voice ringing with excitement as he pointed his gavel towards her. "To the lady in the back." A week later, a plain, unmarked van pulled up to a discreet high-end rehabilitation center in the rolling hills of Connecticut. A large, securely wrapped package was delivered to the front desk with instructions to give it to their newest resident. In a small, Spartan room, the man who was once Richard Beaumont accepted the package. He was thinner now, the arrogance stripped from his features, leaving behind a weary, haunted emptiness. He assumed it was from his lawyers, another document to sign another piece of his old life being legally severed. He tore away the wrapping with listless fingers, and then he froze. It was the Canaletto, the familiar sunlit vista of Venice, the scene of his only childhood solace. He ran a trembling hand over the ornate frame, his mind reeling in confusion. Who would do this? Why? He carefully lifted the painting, and as he turned it over, a small cream-colored envelope fell to the floor. He picked it up. There was no name, no sender. Inset on a simple card were 3 words written in the elegant, perfect script he knew as well as his own. Everyone deserves peace. A sound escaped his throat, a raw, ragged sob that seemed to tear its way up from the very depths of his soul. He sank to his knees, clutching the painting to his chest, and the carefully constructed dams he had built around his heart for a lifetime finally broke. He wept. He wept for his own breathtaking arrogance, for his cruelty, for his blindness. He wept for the quiet, brilliant woman he had shattered and discarded, the one person who, after everything, had reached back through the wreckage of his life, not to gloat, but to offer him this one final impossible act of grace. In that small, sterile room, holding the ghost of his past, Richard Beaumont was finally, truly alone with the man he had become. Thousands of miles away on a stone terrace overlooking the shimmering expanse of Lake Como, Isabella stood with Adrian. The Thorn Foundation had just successfully launched its first international symposium in Milan. The evening air was soft-scented with night-blooming jasmine. Adrian wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Are you happy, Isabella?" he asked quietly. She leaned back against him, looking out at the last embers of sunset, painting the water in strokes of liquid gold. She thought of the woman who had stood alone on the steps of the Met, a creature of midnight blue and broken dreams. She thought of the scholar in the salt-weathered cottage, rediscovering her voice. And she thought of the queen in the golden gown, reclaiming her power. They were all parts of her, a tapestry woven from sorrow and strength. "I am," she said, her voice clear and sure. "I am at peace." The victory wasn't in Richard's fall or in her own rise. The victory was in this moment, the quiet strength to close a painful chapter with compassion instead of vengeance. She had won the war not by destroying her enemy, but by refusing to become him. She had saved the last piece of his legacy not for him, but for herself, a final definitive act of closing the door on the past, so she could fully and freely step into her brilliant future. The story of Isabella Rossi is a powerful reminder that our lowest moments do not have to define us. It's a testament to the fact that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about how we rise. She transformed public humiliation into personal triumph, not through bitter revenge, but by rediscovering her passion and reclaiming her own identity. Her journey from a discarded wife to a celebrated leader shows us that our greatest comeback is often rooted in the talents we've been told to hide. If Isabella's story of resilience and empowerment resonated with you, please help us share it with others who might need to hear it. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with your friends and family. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories of incredible transformation and sweet, sweet karma. Click the notification bell so you never miss an update. Thank you for listening.